"Bad work, sir," replied the man, lowering his voice. "I am going off this minute for——" "For what?" urged the young gentleman. "Why, sir, for the coroner," replied he. "The coroner! The coroner! Why, good God, what has happened?" cried Charles, aghast with horror. "Sir Wynston——" commenced the man, and hesitated. "Well?" pursued Charles, pale and breathless. "Sir Wynston—it is he," said the man. "He, Sir Wynston? Is he dead, or who is? Who is dead?" demanded the young man, almost fiercely. "Sir Wynston, sir. It is he that is dead. There is bad work, sir. Very bad, I'm afraid," replied the man. Charles did not wait to inquire further, but with a feeling of mingled horror and curiosity entered the house. He hurried up the stairs, and entered his mother's sitting room. She was there, perfectly alone, and so deadly pale that she scarcely looked like a living being. In an instant they were locked in one another's arms. "Mother, my dear mother, you are ill," said the young man anxiously. "Oh, no, dear Charles, but frightened, horrified;" and as she said this, the poor lady burst into tears. "What is this horrible affair? Something about Sir Wynston. He is dead, I know, but is it suicide?" he asked. "Oh, no, not suicide," said Mrs. Marston, greatly agitated. "Good God! Then he is murdered!" whispered the young man, growing very pale. "Yes, Charles. Horrible! Dreadful! I can scarcely believe it," replied she, shuddering while she wept. "Where is my father?" inquired the young man after a pause. Why, Charles, darling, why do you ask for him?" she said wildly, grasping him by the arm, as she looked into his face with a terrified expression. Why, he could tell me the particulars of this horrible tragedy," answered he, meeting her agonised look with one of alarm and surprise, "as far as they have been as yet collected. How is he, mother? Is he well?" "Oh, yes, quite well, thank God," she answered, more collectedly. "Quite well, but, of course, dreadfully shocked." "I will go to him, mother. I will see him," said he, turning towards the door. "He has been wretchedly depressed and excited for some days," said Mrs. Marston, dejectedly; "and this dreadful occurrence will, I fear, affect him most deplorably." Section 6. The young man kissed her tenderly and affectionately, and hurried down to the library, where his father usually sat when he desired to be alone, or was engaged in business. He opened the door softly. His father was standing at one of the windows, his face haggard as from a night's watching, unkempt and unshorn, and with his hands thrust into his pockets. At the sound of the revolving door he started, and seeing his son, first recoiled a little, with a strange doubtful expression, and then rallying, walked quickly towards him with a smile, which had in it something still more painful. "Charles, I am glad to see you," he said, shaking him with an agitated pressure by both hands. "Charles, this is a great calamity, and what makes it still worse is that the murderer has escaped. It looks badly, you know." He fixed his gaze for a few moments upon his son, turned abruptly, and walked a little way into the room; then, in a disconcerted manner, he added, hastily turning back, "Not that it signifies to us, of course; but I would fain have justice satisfied." "And who is the wretch, the murderer?" inquired Charles. "Who? Why, every one knows that scoundrel Merton," answered Marston, in an irritated tone. "Merton murdered him in his bed, and fled last night. He is gone, escaped, and I suspect Sir Wynston's man of being an accessory." "Which was Sir Wynston's bedroom?" asked the young man. "The room that old Lady Mostyn had; the room with the portrait of Grace Hamilton in it." I know," said the young man, much excited. "I should wish to see it." "Stay," said Marston; "the door from the passage is bolted on the inside, and I have locked the other. Here is the key, if you choose to go; but you must bring Hughes with you, and do not disturb anything. Leave all as it is. The jury ought to see, and examine for themselves." Charles took the key, and, accompanied by the awestruck servant, he made his way by the back stairs to the door opening from the dressing room, which, as we have said, intervened between the valet's chamber and Sir Wynston's. After a momentary hesitation, Charles turned the key in the door, and stood in the dark chamber of white death. The shutters lay partly open, as the valet had left them some hours before, on making the astounding discovery, which the partially admitted light revealed. The corpse lay in the silk embroidered dressing gown, and other habiliments which Sir Wynston had worn while taking his ease in his chamber, on the preceding night. The coverlet was partially dragged over it; the mouth was gaping, and filled with clotted blood; a wide gash was also visible in the neck, under the ear; and there was a thickening pool of blood at the bedside, and quantities of blood, doubtless from other wounds, had saturated the bedclothes under the body. There lay Sir Wynston, stiffened in the attitude in which the struggle of death had left him, with his stern, stony face and dim, terrible gaze turned up. Charles looked breathlessly for more than a minute upon this mute and unchanging spectacle, and then silently suffered the curtain to fall back again, and stepped, with the light tread of awe, again to the door. There he turned back, and pausing for a minute, said, in a whisper, to the attendant, "And Merton did this?" "Troth, I'm afeard he did, sir," answered the man gloomily. "And has made his escape?" continued Charles. "Yes, sir, he stole away in the night time," replied the servant, "after the murder was done," and he glanced fearfully toward the bed. "God knows where he's gone." "The villain!" muttered Charles. "But what was his motive? Why did he do all this? What does it mean?" "I don't know exactly, sir, but he was very queer for a week or more before it," replied the man. "There was something bad over him for a long time." "It is a terrible thing," said Charles, with a profound sigh; "a terrible and shocking occurrence." He hesitated again at the door, but his feelings had sustained a terrible revulsion at sight of the corpse, and he was no longer disposed to prosecute his purposed examination of the chamber and its contents, with a view to conjecturing the probable circumstances of the murder. "Observe, Hughes, that I have moved nothing in the chamber from the place it occupied when we entered," he said to the servant as they withdrew. He locked the door, and as he passed through the hall, on his return, he encountered his father, and restoring the key, said, "I could not stay there. I'm almost sorry I have seen it. I am overpowered. What a determined, ferocious murder it was! The place is all in a pool of gore. He must have received many wounds." "I can't say. The particulars will be elicited soon enough. Those details are for the inquest. As for me, I hate such spectacles," said Marston, gloomily. "Go now and see your sister. You will find her there." He pointed to the small room where we have first seen her and her fair governess. Charles obeyed the direction, and Marston proceeded himself to his wife's sitting room. The young man, dispirited and horrified by the awful spectacle he had just contemplated, hurried to the little study occupied by his sister. Marston himself ascended, as we have said, the great staircase leading to his wife's private sitting room. "Mrs. Marston," he said, entering, "this is a hateful occurrence, a dreadful thing to have taken place here. I don't mean to affect grief which I don't feel, but the thing is very shocking, and particularly so as having occurred under my roof; but that cannot now be helped. I have resolved to spare no exertions and no influence to bring the assassin to justice; and a coroner's jury will, within a few hours, sift the evidence which we have succeeded in collecting. But my purpose in seeking you now is, to recur to the conversation we yesterday had respecting a member of this establishment." "Mademoiselle de Barras?" suggested the lady. "Yes, Mademoiselle de Barras," echoed Marston. "I wish to say that, having reconsidered the circumstances affecting her, I am absolutely resolved that she shall not continue to be an inmate of this house." He paused, and Mrs. Marston said, "Well, Richard, I am sorry, very sorry for it, but your decision shall never be disputed by me." "Of course," said Marston, drily; "and therefore, the sooner you acquaint her with it, and let her know that she must go, the better." Having said this, he left her, and went to his own chamber, where he proceeded to make his toilet with elaborate propriety, in preparation for the scene which was about to take place under his roof. Mrs. Marston, meanwhile, suffered from a horrible uncertainty. She never harboured, it is true, one doubt as to her husband's perfect innocence of the ghastly crime which filled their house with fear and gloom; but at the same time that she thoroughly and indignantly scouted the possibility of his, under any circumstances, being accessory to such a crime, she experienced a nervous and agonizing anxiety lest any one else should possibly suspect him, however obliquely and faintly, of any participation whatever in the foul deed. This vague fear tortured her. It had taken possession of her mind, and it was the more acutely painful because it was of a kind which precluded the possibility of her dispelling it, as morbid fears so often are dispelled by taking counsel upon its suggestions with a friend. The day wore on, and strange faces began to fill the great parlour. The coroner, accompanied by a physician, had arrived. Several of the gentry in the immediate vicinity had been summoned as jurors, and now began to arrive in succession. Marston, in a handsome and sober suit, received these visitors with a stately and melancholy courtesy befitting the occasion. Mervyn and his son had both been summoned, and of course were in attendance. There being now a sufficient number to form a jury, they were sworn, and immediately proceeded to the chamber where the body of the murdered man was lying. Marston accompanied them, and with a pale and stern countenance, and in a clear and subdued tone, called their attention successively to every particular detail which he conceived important to be noted. Having thus employed some minutes, the jury again returned to the parlour, and the examination of the witnesses commenced. Marston, at his own request, was first sworn and examined. He deposed merely to the circumstance of his parting, on the night previous, with Sir Wynston, and to the state in which he had seen the room and the body in the morning. He mentioned also the fact, that on hearing the alarm in the morning he had hastened from his own chamber to Sir Wynston's, and found, on trying to enter, that the door opening upon the passage was secured on the inside. This circumstance showed that the murderer must have made his egress at least through the valet's chamber, and by the back stairs. Marston's evidence went no further. The next witness sworn was Edward Smith, the servant of the late Sir Wynston Berkley. His evidence was a narrative of the occurrences we have already stated. He described the sounds which he had overheard from his master's room, the subsequent appearance of Merton, and the conversation which had passed between them. He then proceeded to mention that it was his master's custom to have himself called at 7 o'clock, at which hour he usually took some medicine, which it was the valet's duty to bring to him; after which he either settled again to rest, or rose in a short time if unable to sleep. Having measured and prepared the dose in the dressing room, the servant went on to say he had knocked at his master's door, and receiving no answer, had entered the room, and partly unclosed the shutters. He perceived the blood on the carpet, and on opening the curtains saw his master lying with his mouth and eyes open, perfectly dead, and weltering in gore. He had stretched out his hand, and seized that of the dead man, which was quite stiff and cold. Then, losing heart, he had run to the door communicating with the passage, but found it locked, and turned to the other entrance, and ran down the back stairs, crying "Murder!" Mr. Hughes, the butler, and James Carney, another servant, came immediately, and they all three went back into the room. The key was in the outer door, upon the inside, but they did not unlock it until they had viewed the body. There was a great pool of blood in the bed, and in it was lying a red-handled case knife, which was produced, and identified by the witness. Just then they heard Mr. Marston calling for admission, and they opened the door with some difficulty, for the lock was rusty. Mr. Marston had ordered them to leave the things as they were, and had used very stern language to the witness. They had then left the room, securing both doors. This witness underwent a severe and searching examination, but his evidence was clear and consistent. In conclusion, Marston produced a dagger which was stained with blood, and asked the man whether he recognized it. Smith at once stated this to have been the property of his late master, who, when travelling, carried it, together with his pistols, along with him. Since his arrival at Gray Forest, it had lain upon the chimney-piece in his bedroom, where he believed it to have been upon the previous night. James Carney, one of Marston's servants, was next sworn and examined. He had, he said, observed a strange and unaccountable agitation and depression in Merton's manner for some days past. He had also been several times disturbed at night by his talking aloud to himself, and walking to and fro in his room. Their bedrooms were separated by a thin partition, in which was a window, through which Carney had, on the night of the murder, observed a light in Merton's room, and on looking in had seen him dressing hastily. He also saw him twice take up, and again lay down, the red-hafted knife which had been found in the bed of the murdered man. He knew it by the handle being broken near the end. He had no suspicion of Merton having any mischievous intentions, and lay down again to rest. He afterwards heard him pass out of his room, and go slowly up the back stairs leading to the upper story. Shortly after this he had fallen asleep, and did not hear or see him return. He then described, as Smith had already done, the scene which presented itself in the morning, on his accompanying him into Sir Wynston's bedchamber. The next witness examined was a little Irish boy, who described himself as "a poor scholar." His testimony was somewhat singular. He deposed that he had come to the house on the preceding evening, and had been given some supper, and was afterwards permitted to sleep among the hay in one of the lofts. He had, however, discovered what he considered a snugger berth. This was an unused stable, in the further end of which lay a quantity of hay. Among this he had lain down and gone to sleep. He was, however, awakened in the course of the night by the entrance of a man, whom he saw with perfect distinctness in the moonlight, and his description of his dress and appearance tallied exactly with those of Merton. This man occupied himself for some time in washing his hands and face in a stable bucket, which happened to stand by the door, and during the whole of this process he continued to moan and mutter like one in woeful perturbation. He said distinctly twice or thrice, "By God, I am done for," and every now and then he muttered, "and nothing for it after all." When he had done washing his hands, he took something from his coat pocket, and looked at it, shaking his head. At this time he was standing with his back turned toward the boy, so that he could not see what this object might be. The man, however, put it into his breast, and then began to search hurriedly, as it seemed, for some hiding place for it. After looking at the pavement and poking at the chinks of the wall, he suddenly went to the window, and forced up the stone which formed the sill. Under this he threw the object which the boy had seen him examine with so much perplexity, and then he readjusted the stone, and removed the evidences of it having been recently stirred. The boy was a little frightened, but very curious about all that he saw; and when the man left the stable in which he lay, he got up, and, following to the door, peeped after him. He saw him putting on an outside coat and hat, near the yard gate, and then, with great caution, unbolt the wicket, constantly looking back towards the house, and so let himself out. The boy was uneasy, and sat in the hay, wide awake, until morning. He then told the servants what he had seen, and one of the men having raised the stone, which he had not strength to lift, they found the dagger, which Smith had identified as belonging to his master. This weapon was stained with blood, and some hair, which was found to correspond in colour with Sir Wynston's, was sticking in the crevice between the blade and the handle. "It appears very strange that one man should have employed two distinct instruments of this kind," observed Mervyn, after a pause. A silence followed. "Yes, strange; it does seem strange," said Marston, clearing his voice. "Yet it is clear," said another of the jury, "that the same hand did employ them. It is proved that the knife was in Merton's possession just as he left his chamber, and proved also that the dagger was secreted by him after he quitted the house." "Yes," said Marston, with a grisly sort of smile, and glancing sarcastically at Mervyn, while he addressed the last speaker. "I thank you for recalling my attention to the facts. It certainly is not a very pleasant suggestion that there still remains within my household an undetected murderer." Mervyn ruminated for a time, and said he should wish to put a few more questions to Smith and Carney. They were accordingly recalled, and examined in great detail, with a view to ascertain whether any indication of the presence of a second person having visited the chamber with Merton was discoverable. Nothing, however, appeared, except that the valet mentioned the noise and the exclamations which he had indistinctly heard. "You did not mention that before, sir," said Marston, sharply. "I did not think of it, sir," replied the man; "the gentlemen were asking me so many questions; but I told you, sir, about it in the morning." Yes, I believe you did," said Marston; "but you then said that Sir Wynston often talked when he was alone, sir?" "Yes, sir, and so he used, which was the reason I did not go into the room when I heard it," replied the man. "How long afterwards was it when you saw Merton in your own room?" asked Mervyn. "I could not say, sir," answered Smith. "I was soon asleep, and can't say how long I slept before he came." "Was it an hour?" pursued Mervyn. "I can't say," said the man, doubtfully. "Was it 5 hours?" asked Marston. "No, sir, I'm sure it was not 5." "Could you swear it was more than half an hour?" persisted Marston. "No, I could not swear that," answered he. "I'm afraid, Mr. Mervyn, you have found a mare's nest," said Marston, contemptuously. "I have done my duty, sir," retorted Mervyn, cynically, "which plainly requires that I shall have no doubt, which the evidence of the witness can clear up, unsifted and satisfied. I happen to think it of some moment to ascertain, if possible, whether more persons than one were engaged in this atrocious murder. You don't seem to think the question so important a one. Different men, sir, take different views." "Views, sir, in matters of this sort, especially where they tend to multiply suspicions and to implicate others, ought to be supported by something more substantial than mere fancies," retorted Marston. "I don't know what you call fancies," replied Mervyn, testily; "but here are two deadly weapons, a knife and a dagger, each, it would seem, employed in doing this murder. If you see nothing odd in that, I can't enable you to do so." "Well, sir," said Marston, grimly, "the whole thing is, as you term it, odd; and I can see no object in your picking out this particular singularity for long winded criticism. except to cast scandal upon my household by leaving a hideous and vague imputation floating among the members of it. Sir, this is a foul way," he cried sternly, "to gratify a paltry spite." "Mr. Marston," said Mervyn, rising, and thrusting his hands into his pockets, while he confronted him to the full as sternly, "the country knows in which of our hearts the spite, if any there be between us, is harboured. I owe you no friendship, but, sir, I cherish no malice either; and against the worst enemy I have on earth I am incapable of perverting an opportunity like this, and inflicting pain under the pretence of discharging a duty." Marston was on the point of retorting, but the coroner interposed, and besought them to confine their attention strictly to the solemn inquiry which they were summoned together to prosecute. Section 7. There remained still to be examined the surgeon who had accompanied the coroner, for the purpose of reporting upon the extent and nature of the injuries discoverable upon the person of the deceased. He accordingly deposed that, having examined the body, he found no less than 3 deep wounds, inflicted with some sharp instrument. 2 of them had actually penetrated the heart, and were, of course, supposed to cause instant death. Besides these, there were 2 contusions, one upon the back of the head, the other upon the forehead, with a slight abrasion of the eyebrow. There was a large lock of hair torn out by the roots at the front of the head, and the palm and fingers of the right hand were cut. This evidence having been taken, the jury once more repaired to the chamber where the body lay, and proceeded with much minuteness to examine the room, with a view to ascertain, if possible, more particularly the exact circumstances of the murder. The result of this elaborate scrutiny was as follows. The deceased, they conjectured, had fallen asleep in his easy chair, and while he was unconscious, the murderer had stolen into the room, and before attacking his victim, had secured the bedroom door upon the inside. This was argued from the non-discovery of blood upon the handle or any other part of the door. It was supposed that he had then approached Sir Wynston with the view either of robbing or of murdering him while he slept, and that the deceased had awakened just after he had reached him; that a brief and desperate struggle had ensued, in which the assailant had struck his victim with his fist upon the forehead, and having stunned him, had hurriedly clutched him by the hair, and stabbed him with the dagger, which lay close by upon the chimney-piece, forcing his head violently against the back of the chair. This part of the conjecture was supported by the circumstance of there being discovered a lock of hair upon the ground at the spot, and a good deal of blood. The carpet, too, was tumbled, and a water decanter, which had stood upon the table close by, was lying in fragments upon the floor. It was supposed that the murderer had then dragged the half lifeless body to the bed, where, having substituted the knife, which he had probably brought to the room in the same pocket from which the boy afterwards saw him take the dagger, he dispatched him, and either hearing some alarm, perhaps the movement of the valet in the adjoining room, or from some other cause, he dropped the knife in the bed, and was not able to find it again. The wounds upon the hand of the dead man indicated his having caught and struggled to hold the blade of the weapon with which he was assailed. The impression of a bloody hand thrust under the bolster, where it was Sir Wynston's habit to place his purse and watch when making his arrangements for the night, supplied the motive of this otherwise unaccountable atrocity. After some brief consultation, the jury agreed upon a verdict of wilful murder against John Merton, a finding of which the coroner expressed his entire approbation. Marston, as a justice of the peace, had informations, embodying the principal part of the evidence given before the coroner, sworn against Merton, and transmitted a copy of them to the Home Office. A reward for the apprehension of the culprit was forthwith offered, but for some months without effect. Marston had, in the interval, written to several of Sir Wynston's many relations, announcing the catastrophe, and requesting that steps might immediately be taken to have the body removed. Meanwhile undertakers were busy in the chamber of death. The corpse was enclosed in lead, and that again in cedar, and a great oak shell, covered with crimson cloth and gold-headed nails, and a gilt plate recording the age, title, etc., etc., of the deceased, was screwed down firmly over all. Nearly a fortnight elapsed before any reply to Marston's letters was received. A short epistle at last arrived from Lord H., the late Sir Wynston's uncle, deeply regretting the "sad and inexplicable occurrence," and adding that the will, which, on receipt of the "distressing intelligence," was immediately opened and read, contained no direction whatever respecting the sepulture of the deceased, which had therefore better be completed as modestly and expeditiously as possible in the neighbourhood, and in conclusion he directed that the accounts of the undertakers, etc., employed upon the melancholy occasion, might be sent in to Mr. Skelton, who had kindly undertaken to leave London without delay, for the purpose of completing these last arrangements, and who would in any matter of business connected with the deceased represent him, Lord H., as executor of the late baronet. This letter was followed, in a day or two, by the arrival of Skelton, a well dressed, languid, impertinent London tuft hunter, a good deal faded, with a somewhat sallow and puffy face, charged with a pleasant combination at once of meanness, insolence, and sensuality, just such a person as Sir Wynston's parasite might have been expected to prove. However well disposed to impress the natives with high notions of his extraordinary refinement and importance, he very soon discovered that, in Marston, he had stumbled upon a man of the world, and one thoroughly versed in the ways and characters of London life. After some ineffectual attempts, therefore, to overawe and astonish his host, Mr. Skelton became aware of the fruitlessness of the effort, and condescended to abate somewhat of his pretensions. Marston could not avoid inviting this person to pass the night at his house, an invitation which was accepted, of course; and next morning, after a late breakfast, Mr. Skelton observed, with a yawn, "And now, about this body. Poor Berkeley! What do you propose to do with him?" "I have no proposition to make," said Marston, drily. "It is no affair of mine, except that the body may be removed without more delay. I have no suggestion to offer." "H.'s notion was to have him buried as near the spot as may be," said Skelton. Marston nodded. "There is a kind of vault, is not there, in the demesne, a family burial place?" inquired the visitor. "Yes, sir," replied Marston, curtly. "Well?" drawled Skelton. "Well, sir, what then?" responded Marston. "Why, as the wish of the parties is to have him buried, poor fellow, as quietly as possible, I think he might just as well be laid there as anywhere else." "Had I desired it, Mr. Skelton, I should myself have made the offer," said Marston, abruptly. "Then you don't wish it?" said Skelton. "No, sir, certainly not, most peremptorily not," answered Marston, with more sharpness than, in his early days, he would have thought quite consistent with politeness. "Perhaps," replied Skelton, for want of something better to say, and with a callous sort of levity, "perhaps you hold the idea some people do that murdered men can't rest in their graves until their murderers have expiated their guilt?" Marston made no reply, but shot 2 or 3 lurid glances from under his brow at the speaker. "Well, then, at all events," continued Skelton, indolently resuming his theme, "if you decline your assistance, may I at least hope for your advice? Knowing nothing of this country, I would ask you whither you would recommend me to have the body conveyed." "I don't care to advise in the matter," said Marston; "but if I were directing, I should have the remains buried in Chester. It is not more than 20 miles from this, and if at any future time his family should desire to remove the body, it could be effected more easily from thence. But you can decide." "Egad, I believe you are right," said Skelton, glad to be relieved of the trouble of thinking about the matter, "and I shall take your advice." In accordance with this declaration, the body was, within 24 hours, removed to Chester, and buried there, Mr. Skelton attending on behalf of Sir Wynston's numerous and afflicted friends and relatives. There are certain heartaches for which time brings no healing; nay, which grow but the sorer and fiercer as days and years roll on. Of this kind, perhaps, were the stern and bitter feelings which now darkened the face of Marston with an almost perpetual gloom. His habits became even more unsocial than before. The society of his son he no longer seemed to enjoy. Long and solitary rambles in his wild and extensive demesne consumed the listless hours of his waking existence; and when the weather prevented this, he shut himself up, upon pretence of business, in his study. He had not, since the occasion we have already mentioned, referred to the intended departure of Mademoiselle de Barras. Truth to say, his feelings with respect to that young lady were of a conflicting and mysterious kind; and as often as his dark thoughts wandered to her, which indeed was frequently enough, his muttered exclamation seemed to imply some painful and horrible suspicions respecting her. "Yes," he would mutter, "I thought I heard your light foot upon the lobby, on that accursed night. Fancy! Well, it may have been, but assuredly a strange fancy. I cannot comprehend that woman. She baffles my scrutiny. I have looked into her face with an eye she might well understand, were it indeed as I sometimes suspect, and she has been calm and unmoved. I have watched and studied her. Still, doubt, hideous doubt. Is she what she seems, or a tigress?" Mrs. Marston, on the other hand, procrastinated from day to day the painful task of announcing to Mademoiselle de Barras the stern message with which she had been charged by her husband. And thus several weeks had passed, and she began to think that his silence upon the subject, notwithstanding his seeing the young French lady at breakfast every morning, amounted to a kind of tacit intimation that the sentence of banishment was not to be carried into immediate execution, but to be kept suspended over the unconscious offender. It was now 6 or 8 weeks since the hearse carrying away the remains of the ill-fated Sir Wynston Berkley had driven down the dusky avenue. The autumn was deepening into winter, and as Marston gloomily trod the woods of Grey Forest, the withered leaves whirled drearily along his pathway, and the gusts that swayed the mighty branches above him were rude and ungenial. It was a bleak and sombre day, and as he broke into a long and picturesque vista, deep among the most sequestered woods, he suddenly saw before him, and scarcely 20 paces from the spot on which he stood, an apparition, which for some moments absolutely froze him to the earth. Travel soiled, tattered, pale, and wasted, John Merton, the murderer, stood before him. He did not exhibit the smallest disposition to turn about and make his escape. On the contrary, he remained perfectly motionless, looking upon his former master with a wild and sorrowful gaze. Marston twice or thrice essayed to speak. His face was white as death, and had he beheld the spectre of the murdered baronet himself, he could not have met the sight with a countenance of ghastlier horror. "Take me, sir," said Merton doggedly. Still Marston did not stir. "Arrest me, sir, in God's name. Here I am," he repeated, dropping his arms by his side. "I'll go with you wherever you tell me." "Murderer!" cried Marston, with a sudden burst of furious horror. "Murderer! Assassin! Miscreant! Take that!" And as he spoke, he discharged one of the pistols he always carried about him, full at the wretched man. The shot did not take effect, and Merton made no other gesture but to clasp his hands together, with an agonised pressure, whilst his head sunk upon his breast. "Shoot me, shoot me," he said hoarsely. "Kill me like a dog. Better for me to be dead than what I am." The report of Marston's pistol had, however, reached another ear, and its ringing echoes had hardly ceased to vibrate among the trees, when a stern shout was heard not 50 yards away, and, breathless and amazed, Charles Marston sprang to the place. His father looked from Merton to him, and from him again to Merton, with a guilty and stupefied scowl, still holding the smoking pistol in his hand. "How Good God, Merton!" ejaculated Charles. "Ay, sir, Merton, ready to go to gaol, or wherever you will," said the man recklessly. "A murderer, a madman. Don't believe him," muttered Marston, scarce audibly, with lips as white as wax. "Do you surrender yourself, Merton?" demanded the young man sternly, advancing toward him. "Yes, sir, I desire nothing more. God knows I wish to die," responded he, despairingly, and advancing slowly to meet Charles. "Come, then," said young Marston, seizing him by the collar, "come quietly to the house. Guilty and unhappy man, you are now my prisoner, and depend upon it I shall not let you go." "I don't want to go, I tell you, sir. I have travelled 15 miles to day to come here and give myself up to the master." "Accursed madman!" said Marston unconsciously, gazing at the prisoner; and then, suddenly rousing himself, he said, "Well, miscreant, you wish to die, and, by God, you are in a fair way to have your wish." "So best," said the man doggedly. "I don't want to live. I wish I was in my grave. I wish I was dead a year ago." Some 15 minutes afterwards, Merton, accompanied by Marston and his son Charles, entered the hall of the mansion which, not 10 weeks before, he had quitted under circumstances so guilty and terrible. When they reached the house, Merton seemed much agitated, and wept bitterly on seeing 2 or 3 of his former fellow servants, who looked on him in silence as they passed, with a gloomy and fearful curiosity. These, too, were succeeded by others, peeping and whispering, and, upon one pretence or another, crossing and recrossing the hall, and stealing hurried glances at the criminal. Merton sat with his face buried in his hands, sobbing, and taking no note of the humiliating scrutiny of which he was the subject. Meanwhile, Marston, pale and agitated, made out his committal, and, having sworn in several of his labourers and servants as special constables, dispatched the prisoner in their charge to the country gaol, where, under lock and key, we leave him in safe custody for the present. After this event, Marston became excited and restless. He scarcely ate or slept, and his health seemed now as much scattered as his spirits had been before. One day he glided into the room in which, as we have said, it was Mrs. Marston's habit frequently to sit alone. His wife was there, and as he entered, she uttered an exclamation of doubtful joy and surprise. He sat down near her in silence, and for some time looked gloomily on the ground. She did not care to question him, and anxiously waited until he should open the conversation. At length he raised his eyes, and looking full at her, asked abruptly, "Well, what about mademoiselle?" Mrs. Marston was embarrassed and hesitated. "I told you what I wished with respect to that young lady some time ago, and commissioned you to acquaint her with my pleasure; and yet I find her still here, and apparently as much established as ever." Again Mrs. Marston hesitated. She scarcely knew how to confess to him that she had not conveyed his message. "Don't suppose, Gertrude, that I wish to find fault. I merely wanted to know whether you had told Mademoiselle de Barras that we were agreed as to the necessity, or expediency, or what you please, of dispensing henceforward with her services. I perceive by your manner that you have not done so. I have no doubt your motive was a kind one, but my decision remains unaltered; and I now assure you again that I wish you to speak to her. I wish you explicitly to let her know my wishes and yours." "Not mine, Richard," she answered faintly. "Well, mine then," he replied roughly. "We shan't quarrel about that." "And how soon do you wish me to speak to her on this, to both of us, most painful subject?" asked she, with a sigh. "To day, this hour, this minute, if you can. In short, the sooner the better," he replied, rising. "I see no reason for holding it back any longer. I am sorry my wishes were not complied with immediately. Pray let there be no further hesitation or delay. I shall expect to learn this evening that all is arranged." Marston, having thus spoken, left her abruptly, went down to his study with a swift step, shut himself in, and throwing himself into a great chair, gave a loose to his agitation, which was extreme. Meanwhile Mrs. Marston had sent for Mademoiselle de Barras, anxious to get through her painful task as speedily as possible. The fair French girl quickly presented herself. "Sit down, mademoiselle," said Mrs. Marston, taking her hand kindly, and drawing her to the prie-dieu chair beside herself. Mademoiselle de Barras sat down, and as she did so, read the countenance of her patroness with one rapid glance of her flashing eyes. These eyes, however, when Mrs. Marston looked at her the next moment, were sunk softly and sadly upon the floor. There was a heightened colour, however, in her cheek, and a quicker heaving of her bosom, which indicated the excitement of an anticipated and painful disclosure. The outward contrast of the two women, whose hands were so lovingly locked together, was almost as striking as the moral contrast of their hearts; the one so chastened, sad, and gentle; the other so capable of pride and passion; so darkly excitable, and yet so mysteriously beautiful; the one like a Niobe seen in the softest moonshine; the other a Venus lighted in the glare of distant conflagration. "Mademoiselle, dear mademoiselle, I am so much grieved at what I have to say, that I hardly know how to speak to you," said poor Mrs. Marston, pressing her hand; "but Mr. Marston has twice desired me to tell you, what you will hear with far less pain than it costs me to say it." Mademoiselle de Barras stole another flashing glance at her companion, but did not speak. Section 8. "Mr. Marston still persists, mademoiselle, in desiring that we shall part." "Est-il possible?" cried the Frenchwoman, with a genuine start. "Indeed, mademoiselle, you may well be surprised," said Mrs. Marston, encountering her full and dilated gaze, which, however, dropped again in a moment to the ground. "You may indeed naturally be surprised and shocked at this, to me, most severe decision." "When did he last speak of it?" said she rapidly. "But a few moments since," answered Mrs. Marston. "Ha!" said mademoiselle, and remained silent and motionless for more than a minute. "Madame," she cried at last mournfully, "I suppose then I must go; but it tears my heart to leave you and dear Miss Rhoda. I would be very happy if, before departing, you would permit me, dear madame, once more to assure Monsieur Marston of my innocence, and in his presence to call heaven to witness how unjust are all his suspicions." "Do so, mademoiselle, and I will add my earnest assurances again; though, heaven knows," she said despondingly, "I anticipate little success. But it is well to leave no chance untried." Marston was sitting, as we have said, in his library. His agitation had given place to a listless gloom, and he leaned back in his chair, his head supported by his hand, and undisturbed, except by the occasional fall of the embers upon the hearth. There was a knock at the chamber door. His back was towards it, and without turning or moving, he called to the applicant to enter. The door opened, closed again, a light tread was audible. A tall shadow darkened the wall. Marston looked round, and Mademoiselle de Barras was standing before him. Without knowing how or why, he rose, and stood gazing upon her in silence. "Madame de Barras," he said at last, in a tone of cold surprise. "Yes, poor Mademoiselle de Barras," replied the sweet voice of the young Frenchwoman, while her lips hardly moved as the melancholy tones passed them. "Well, mademoiselle, what do you desire?" he asked, in the same cold accents, and averting his eyes. "Ah, monsieur, do you ask? Can you pretend to be ignorant? Have you not sent me a message, a cruel, cruel message?" She spoke so low and gently that a person at the other end of the room could hardly have heard her words. "Yes, Mademoiselle de Barras, I did send you a message," he replied doggedly; "a cruel one you will scarcely presume to call it, when you reflect upon your own conduct, and the circumstances which have provoked the measures I have taken." "What have I done, monsieur? What circumstances do you mean?" asked she plaintively. "What have you done? A pretty question, truly, ha, ha!" he replied, bitterly; and then again, with suppressed vehemence, "Ask your own heart, mademoiselle." "I have asked, I do ask, and my heart answers nothing," she replied, raising her fine melancholy eyes for a moment to his face. "It lies, then," he retorted, with a fierce scoff. "Monsieur, before heaven I swear, you wrong me foully," she said earnestly, clasping her hands together. "Did ever woman say she was accused rightly, mademoiselle?" retorted Marston, with a sneer. "I don't know, I don't care. I only know that I am innocent," continued she, piteously. "I call heaven to witness you have wronged me." "Wronged you! Why, after all, with what have I charged you?" said he, scoffingly. "But let that pass. I have formed my opinions, arrived at my conclusions. If I have not named them broadly, you at least seem to understand their nature thoroughly. I know the world. I am no novice in the arts of women, mademoiselle. Reserve your vows and attestations for schoolboys and simpletons. They are sadly thrown away upon me." Marston paced to and fro, with his hands thrust into his pockets, as he thus spoke. "Then you don't, or rather, you will not believe what I tell you?" said she, imploringly. "No," he answered, drily and slowly, as he passed her, "I don't, and I won't, as you say, believe one word of it; so pray spare yourself further trouble about the matter." She raised her head, and darted after him a glance that seemed absolutely to blaze, and at the same time smote her little hand fast clenched upon her breast. The words, however, that trembled on her pale lips were not uttered. Her eyes were again cast down, and her fingers played with the little locket that hung round her neck. "I must make, before I go," she said, with a deep sigh and a melancholy voice, "one confidence, one last confidence, judge me by it. You cannot choose but believe me now. It is a secret, and it must even here be whispered, whispered, whispered." As she spoke, the colour fled from her face, and her tones became so strange and resolute, that Marston turned short upon his heel, and stopped before her. She looked in his face. He frowned, but lowered his eyes. She drew nearer, laid her hand upon his shoulder, and whispered for a few moments in his ear. He raised his face suddenly. Its features were sharp and fixed. Its hue was changed. It was livid and moveless, like a face cut in grey stone. He staggered back a little more, and then a little more, and fell backward. Fortunately, the chair in which he had been sitting received him, and he lay there insensible as a corpse. When at last his eyes opened, there was no gleam of triumph, no shade of anger, nothing perceptible of guilt or menace, in the young woman's countenance. The flush had returned to her cheeks; her dimpled chin had sunk upon her full white throat. Sorrow, shame, and pride seemed struggling in her handsome face, and she stood before him like a beautiful penitent, who has just made a strange and humbling shrift to her father confessor. Next day Marston was mounting his horse for a solitary ride through his park, when Dr. Danvers rode abruptly into the courtyard from the back entrance. Marston touched his hat, and said, "I don't stand on forms with you, doctor, and you, I know, will waive ceremony with me. You will find Mrs. Marston at home." "Nay, my dear sir," interrupted the clergyman, sitting firm in his saddle, "my business lies with you to day." "The devil it does," said Marston, with discontented surprise. "Truly it does, sir," repeated he, with a look of gentle reproof, for the profanity of Marston's ejaculation, far more than the rudeness of his manner, offended him; "and I grieve that your surprise should have somewhat carried you away." "Well, then, Dr. Danvers," interrupted Marston drily, and without heeding his concluding remark, "if you really have business with me, it is at all events of no very pressing kind, and may be as well told after supper as now. So pray go into the house and rest yourself. We can talk together in the evening." "My horse is not tired," said the clergyman, patting his steed's neck, "and if you do not object, I will ride by your side for a short time, and as we go I can say out what I have to tell." "Well, well, be it so," said Marston, with suppressed impatience; and without more ceremony he rode slowly along the avenue, and turned off upon the southward, in the direction of the wildest portion of his wooded demesne, the clergyman keeping close beside him. They proceeded some little way at a walk before Dr. Danvers spoke. "I have been twice or thrice with that unhappy man," at length he said. "What unhappy man? Unhappiness is no distinguishing singularity, is it?" said Marston, sharply. "No, truly, you have well said," replied Dr. Danvers. "True it is that man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. I speak, however, of your servant Merton, a most unhappy wretch." "Ha! You have been with him, you say?" replied Marston, with evident interest and anxiety. "Yes, several times, and conversed with him long and gravely," continued the clergyman. "Humph! I thought that had been the chaplain's business, not yours, my good friend," observed Marston. "He has been unwell," replied Dr. Danvers, "and thus, for a day or two, I took his duty, and this poor man Merton, having known something of me, preferred seeing me rather than a stranger; and so, at the chaplain's desire and his, I continued my visits." "Well, and you have taught him to pray and sing psalms, I suppose; and what has come of it all?" demanded Marston, testily. "He does pray, indeed, poor man, and I trust his prayers are heard with mercy at the throne of grace," said his companion, in his earnestness disregarding the sneering tone of his companion. "He is full of compunction, and admits his guilt." "Oh, that is well; well for himself, well for his soul, at least. You are sure of it? He confesses his guilt?" Marston put his question so rapidly and excitedly that the clergyman looked with a slight expression of surprise; and recovering himself, he added, in an unconcerned tone, "Well, well, it was just as well he did so. The evidence is too clear for doubt or mystification. He knew he had no chance, and has taken the seemliest course; and doubtless the best for his hopes hereafter." "I did not question him upon the subject," said Dr. Danvers. "I even declined to hear him speak upon it at first; but he told me he was resolved to offer no defence, and that he saw the finger of God in the fate which had overtaken him." "He will plead guilty, then, I suppose?" suggested Marston, watching the countenance of his companion with an anxious and somewhat sinister eye. "His words seem to imply so much," answered he; "and having thus frankly owned his guilt, and avowed his resolution to let the law take its due course in his case, without obstruction or evasion, I urged him to complete the grand work he had begun, and to confess to you, or to some other magistrate fully, and in detail, every circumstance connected with the perpetration of the dreadful deed." Marston knit his brows, and rode on for some minutes in silence. At length he said abruptly, "In this, it seems to me, sir, you a little exceeded your commission." "How so, my dear sir?" asked the clergyman. "Why, sir," answered Marston, "the man may possibly change his mind before the day of trial; and it is the hangman's office, not yours, my good sir, to fasten the halter about his neck. You will pardon my freedom, but were this deposition made, as you suggest, it would undoubtedly hang him." "God forbid, Mr. Marston," rejoined Danvers, "that I should induce the unhappy man to forfeit his last chances of escape, and to shut the door of human mercy against himself, but on this he seems already resolved. He says so. He has solemnly declared his resolution to me; and even against my warning, again and again reiterated the same declaration. That I should have thought quite enough, were I in your place, without inviting a detailed description of the whole process by which this detestable butchery was consummated. What more than the simple knowledge of the man's guilt does any mortal desire? Guilty or not guilty is the plain question which the law asks, and no more. Take my advice, sir, as a poor Protestant layman, and leave the acts of the confessional and inquisition to popish priests." "Nay, Mr. Marston, you greatly misconceive me. As matters stand, there exists among the coroner's jury, and thus among the public, some faint and unfounded suspicion of the possibility of Merton's having had an accessory or accomplice in the perpetration of this foul murder." "It is a lie, sir, a malignant, damned lie. The jury believe no such thing, nor the public either," said Marston, starting in his saddle, and speaking in a voice of thunder. "You have been crammed with lies, sir, malicious, unmeaning, vindictive lies; lies invented to asperse my family, and torture my feelings; suggested in my presence by that scoundrel Mervyn, and scouted by the common sense of the jury." "I do assure you," replied Dr. Danvers, in a voice which seemed scarcely audible, after the stunning and passionate explosion of Marston's wrath, "I did not imagine that you could feel thus sorely upon the point. Nay, I thought that you yourself were not without such painful doubts." "Again I tell you, sir," said Marston, in a tone somewhat calmer, but no less stern, "such doubts as you describe have no existence. Your unsuspecting ear has been alarmed by a vindictive wretch, an old scoundrel who has scarce a passion left but spite towards me. Few such there are, thank God; few such villains as would, from a man's very calamities, distil poison to kill the peace and character of his family." "I am sorry, Mr. Marston," said the clergyman, "you have formed so ill an opinion of a neighbour; and I am very sure that Mr. Mervyn meant you no ill in frankly expressing whatever doubt still rested on his mind, after the evidence was taken." "He did, the scoundrel," said Marston, furiously striking his hand, in which his whip was clutched, upon his thigh. "He did mean to wound and torture me, and with the same object he persists in circulating what he calls his doubts. Meant me no ill, forsooth! Why, my great God, sir, could any man be so stupid as not to perceive that the suggestion of such suspicions, absurd, contradictory, incredible as they are, was precisely the thing to exasperate feelings sufficiently troubled already, and not content with raising the question where it was scouted, as I said, as soon as named, the vindictive slanderer proceeds to propagate and publish his pretended surmises, damn him." "Mr. Marston, you will pardon me when I say that, as a Christian minister, I cannot suffer a spirit so ill as that you manifest, and language so unseemly as that you have just uttered, to pass unreproved," said Danvers, solemnly. "If you will cherish those bitter and unchristian feelings, at least for the brief space that I am with you, command your fierce, unbecoming words." Marston was about to make a sneering retort, but restrained himself, and turned his head away. "The wretched man himself appears now very anxious to make some further disclosures," resumed Dr. Danvers, after a pause; "and I recommended him to make them to you, Mr. Marston, as the most natural depository of such a statement." "Well, Mr. Danvers, to cut the matter short, as it appears that a confession of some sort is to be made, be it so. I will attend and receive it. The judges will not be here for 8 or 10 weeks to come, so there is no great hurry about it. I shall ride down to the town, and see him in the gaol some time in the next week." With this assurance, Marston parted from the old clergyman, and rode on alone through the furze and fern of his wild and sombre park. After supper that evening, Marston found himself alone in the parlour with his wife. Mrs. Marston availed herself of the opportunity to redeem her pledge to Mademoiselle de Barras. She was not aware of the strange interview which had taken place between him and the lady for whom she pleaded. The result of her renewed entreaties perhaps the reader has anticipated. Marston listened, doubted, listened, hesitated again, put questions, pondered the answers, debated the matter inwardly, and at last gruffly consented to give the young lady another trial, and permit her to remain some time longer. Poor Mrs. Marston, little suspecting the dreadful future, overwhelmed her husband with gratitude for granting to her entreaties, as he had predetermined to do, this fatal boon. Not caring to protract this scene, either from a disinclination to listen to expressions of affection, which had long lost their charm for him, and had become even positively distasteful, or perhaps from some instinctive recoil from the warm expression of gratitude from lips which, were the truth revealed, might justly have trembled with execration and reproach, he abruptly left the room, and Mrs. Marston, full of her good news, hastened, in the kindness of her heart, to communicate the fancied result of her advocacy to Mademoiselle de Barras. It was about a week after this that Marston was one evening surprised in his study by the receipt of the following letter from Dr. Danvers. "My dear Sir, you will be shocked to hear that Merton is most dangerously ill, and at this moment in imminent peril. He is thoroughly conscious of his situation, and himself regards it as a merciful interposition of Providence to spare him the disgrace and terror of the dreadful fate which he anticipated. The unhappy man has twice repeated his anxious desire this day to state some facts connected with the murder of the late Sir Wynston Berkley, which he says it is of the utmost moment that you should hear. He says that he could not leave the world in peace without having made this disclosure, which he especially desires to make to yourself, and entreats that you will come to receive his communication as early as you can in the morning. This is indeed needful, as the physician says that he is fast sinking. I offer no apology for adding my earnest solicitations to those of the dying man, and am, dear sir, your very obedient servant, J. Danvers. Section 9. "He regards it as a merciful interposition of Providence," muttered Marston, as he closed the letter, with a sneer. "Well, some men have odd notions of mercy and Providence, to be sure; but if it pleases him, certainly I shall not complain for one." Marston was all this evening in better spirits than he had enjoyed for months, or even years. A mountain seemed to have been lifted from his heart. He joined in the conversation during and after supper, listened with apparent interest, talked with animation, and even laughed and jested. It is needless to say all this flowed not from the healthy cheer of a heart at ease, but from the excited and almost feverish sense of sudden relief. Next morning Marston rode into the old-fashioned town, at the further end of which the dingy and grated front of the gaol looked warningly out upon the rustic passengers. He passed the sentries, and made his inquiries of the official at the hatch. He was relieved from the necessity of pushing these into detail, however, by the appearance of the physician, who at that moment passed from the interior of the prison. "Dr. Danvers told me he expected to see you here this morning," said the medical man, after the customary salutation had been interchanged. "Your call, I believe, is connected with the prisoner, John Merton." "Yes, sir, so it is," said Marston. "Is he in a condition, pray, to make a statement of considerable length?" "Far from it, Mr. Marston. He has but a few hours to live," answered the physician, "and is now insensible. But I believe he last night saw Dr. Danvers, and told him whatever was weighing upon his mind." "Ah! And can you say where Dr. Danvers now is?" inquired Marston, anxiously and hurriedly. "Not here, is he?" "No; but I saw him, as I came here, not 10 minutes since, ride into the town. It is market day, and you will probably find him somewhere in the High Street for an hour or two to come," answered he. Marston thanked him, and, lost in abstraction, rode down to the little inn, entered a sitting room, and wrote a hurried line to Dr. Danvers, entreating his attendance there, as a place where they might converse less interruptedly than in the street; and committing this note to the waiter, with the injunction to deliver it at once, and an intimation of where Dr. Danvers was probably to be found, he awaited, with intense and agitating anxiety, the arrival of the clergyman. It was not for nearly 10 minutes, however, which his impatience magnified into an eternity, that the well-known voice of Dr. Danvers reached him from the little hall. It was in vain that Marston strove to curb his violent agitation. His heart swelled as if it would smother him. He felt, as it were, the chill of death pervade his frame, and he could scarcely see the door through which he momentarily expected the entrance of the clergyman. A few minutes more, and Dr. Danvers entered the little apartment. "My dear sir," said he, gravely and earnestly, as he grasped the cold hand of Marston, "I am rejoiced to see you. I have matters of great moment, and the strangest mystery to lay before you." "I dare say, I was sure that is, I suspected so much," answered Marston, breathing fast and looking very pale. "I heard at the prison that the murderer, Merton, was fast dying, and now is in an unconscious state; and from the physician, that you had seen him, at his urgent entreaty, last night. My mind misgives me, sir, I fear I know not what. I long, yet dread, to hear the wretched man's confession. For God's sake, tell me, does it implicate anybody else in the guilt?" "No, no one specifically; but it has thrown a hideous additional mystery over the occurrence. Listen to me, my dear sir, and the whole narrative, as he stated it to me, shall be related now to you," said Dr. Danvers. Marston had closed the door carefully, and they sat down together at the further end of the apartment. Marston, breathless and ghastly pale, his lips compressed, his brows knit, and his dark, dilated gaze fixed immovably upon the speaker. Dr. Danvers, on the other hand, tranquil and solemn, and with perhaps some shade of awe overcasting the habitual sweetness of his countenance. "His confession was a strange one," renewed Dr. Danvers, shaking his head gravely. "He said that the first idea of the crime was suggested by Sir Wynston's man accidentally mentioning, a few days after their arrival, that his master slept with his bank notes, to the amount of some hundreds of pounds, in a pocket book under his pillow. He declared that, as the man mentioned this circumstance, something muttered the infernal suggestion in his ear, and from that moment he was the slave of that one idea. It was ever present with him. He contended against it in vain. He dreaded and abhorred it; but still it possessed him. He felt his power of resistance yielding. This horrible stranger which had stolen into his heart waxed in power and importunity, and tormented him day and night. He resolved to fly from the house. He gave notice to you and Mrs. Marston of his intended departure; but accident protracted his stay until that fatal night which sealed his doom. The influence which had mastered him forced him to rise from his bed and take the knife, the discovery of which afterwards helped to convict him, and led him to Sir Wynston's chamber. He entered. It was a moonlit night. Here the clergyman, glancing round the room, lowered his voice, and advanced his lips so near to Marston that their heads nearly touched. In this tone and attitude he continued his narrative for a few minutes. At the end of this brief space Marston rose up slowly, and with a movement backward, every feature strung with horror, and saying in a long whisper the one word, "Yes," which seemed like the hiss of a snake before he makes his last deadly spring. Both were silent for a time. At last Marston broke out with hoarse vehemence, "Dreadful! Horrible! Oh, God! God! My God, how frightful!" And throwing himself into a chair, he clasped his hands across his eyes and forehead, while the sweat of agony literally poured down his pale face. "Truly it is so," said the clergyman, scarcely above his breath; and after a long interval, "horrible indeed." "Well," said Marston, rising suddenly to his feet, wiping the dews of horror from his face, and looking wildly round, like one newly awoke from a nightmare, "I must make the most of this momentous and startling disclosure. I shall spare no pains to come at the truth," said he, energetically. "Meanwhile, my dear sir, for the sake of justice and of mercy, observe secrecy. Leave me to sift this matter. Give no note anywhere that we suspect. Observe this reserve and security, and with it detection will follow. Breathe but one word, and you arm the guilty with double caution, and turn licentious gossip loose upon the fame of an innocent and troubled family. Once more I entreat, I expect, I implore silence; silence, at least, for the present; silence." "I quite agree with you, my dear Mr. Marston," answered Dr. Danvers. "I have not divulged one syllable of that poor wretch's confession, save to yourself alone. You, as a magistrate, a relative of the murdered gentleman, and the head of that establishment among whom the guilt rests, are invested with an interest in detecting, and powers of sifting the truth in this matter, such as none other possesses. I clearly see, with you too, the inexpediency and folly of talking, for talking's sake, of this affair. I mean to keep my counsel, and shall most assuredly, irrespectively even of your request, which should, however, of course, have weight with me, maintain a strict and cautious silence upon this subject." Some little time longer they remained together, and Marston, buried in strange thoughts, took his leave, and rode slowly back to Grey Forest. Months passed away, a year, and more, and though no new character appeared upon the stage, the relations which had subsisted among the old ones became, in some respects, very materially altered. A gradual and disagreeable change came over Mademoiselle de Barras's manner. Her affectionate attentions to Mrs. Marston became less and less frequent. Nor was the change merely confined to this growing coldness. There was something of a positive and still more unpleasant kind in the alteration we have noted. There was a certain independence and carelessness, conveyed in a hundred intangible but significant little incidents and looks; a something which, without being open to formal rebuke or remonstrance, yet bordered, in effect, upon impertinence and even insolence. This indescribable and provoking self-assertion, implied in glances, tones, emphasis, and general bearing, surprised Mrs. Marston far more than it irritated her. As often as she experienced one of these studied slights or insinuated impertinences, she revolved in her own mind all the incidents of their past intercourse, in the vain endeavour to recollect some one among them which could possibly account for the offensive change so manifest in the conduct of the young Frenchwoman. Mrs. Marston, although she sometimes rebuked these artful affronts by a grave look, a cold tone, or a distant manner, yet had too much dignity to engage in a petty warfare of annoyance, and had in reality no substantial and well-defined ground of complaint against her, such as would have warranted her either in taking the young lady herself to task, or in bringing her conduct under the censure of Marston. One evening it happened that Mrs. Marston and Mademoiselle de Barras had been left alone together. After the supper party had dispersed, they had been for a long time silent. Mrs. Marston resolved to improve the tête-à-tête, for the purpose of eliciting from mademoiselle an explanation of her strange behaviour. "Mademoiselle," said she, "I have lately observed a very marked change in your conduct to me." "Indeed!" said the Frenchwoman. "Yes, mademoiselle. You must be yourself perfectly aware of that change. It is a studied and intentional one," continued Mrs. Marston, in a gentle but dignified tone. "Although I have felt some doubt as to whether it were advisable, so long as you observe toward me the forms of external respect, and punctually discharge the duties you have undertaken, to open any discussion whatever upon the subject, yet I have thought it better to give you a fair opportunity of explaining frankly, should you desire to do so, the feelings and impressions under which you are acting." "You are very obliging, madame," said she coolly. "It is quite clear, mademoiselle, that you have either misunderstood me, or that you are dissatisfied with your situation among us. Your conduct cannot otherwise be accounted for," said Mrs. Marston, gravely. "My conduct! Ma foi, what conduct?" retorted the handsome Frenchwoman, confidently, and with a disdainful glance. "If you question the fact, mademoiselle," said the elder lady, "it is enough. Your ungracious manner and ungentle looks, I presume, arise from what appears to you a sufficient and well defined cause, of which, however, I know nothing." "I really was not aware," said Mademoiselle de Barras, with a supercilious smile, "that my looks and my manner was subjected to so strict a criticism, or that it was my duty to regulate both according to so nice and difficult a standard." "Well, mademoiselle," continued Mrs. Marston, "it is plain that whatever may be the cause of your dissatisfaction, you are resolved against confiding it to me. I only wish to know frankly from your own lips whether you have formed a wish to leave this situation. If so, I entreat you to declare it freely." "You are very obliging indeed, madame," said the pretty foreigner, drily, "but I have no such wish, at least at present." "Very well, mademoiselle," replied Mrs. Marston, with gentle dignity. "I regret your want of candour on your own account. You would, I am sure, be much happier were you to deal frankly with me." "May I now have your permission, madame, to retire to my room?" asked the French girl, rising and making a low courtesy. "That is, if madame has nothing further to censure." "Certainly, mademoiselle, I have nothing further to say," replied the elder lady. The Frenchwoman made another and a deeper courtesy, and withdrew. Mrs. Marston, however, heard, as she was designed to do, the young lady tittering and whispering to herself as she lighted her candle in the hall. This scene mortified and grieved poor Mrs. Marston inexpressibly. She was little, if at all, accessible to emotions of anger, and certainly none such mingled in the feelings with which she regarded Mademoiselle de Barras. But she had found in this girl a companion, and even a confidant in her melancholy solitude. She had believed her affectionate, sympathetic, tender, and the disappointment was as bitter as unimagined. The annoyances which she was fated to receive from Mademoiselle de Barras were destined, however, to grow in number and in magnitude. The Frenchwoman sometimes took a fancy, for some unrevealed purpose, to talk a good deal to Mrs. Marston, and on such occasions would persist, notwithstanding that lady's marked reserve and discouragement, in chatting away, as if she were conscious that her conversation was the most welcome entertainment possible to her really unwilling auditor. No one of their interviews did she ever suffer to close without in some way or other suggesting or insinuating something mysterious and untold to the prejudice of Mr. Marston. Those vague and intangible hints, the meaning of which, for an instant legible and terrific, seemed in another moment to dissolve and disappear, tortured Mrs. Marston like the intrusion of a spectre; and this, along with the portentous change, rather felt than visible, in mademoiselle's conduct toward her, invested the beautiful Frenchwoman, in the eyes of her former friend and patroness, with an indefinable character that was not only repulsive but formidable. Mrs. Marston's feelings with respect to this person were still further disturbed by the half conveyed hints and innuendoes of her own maid, who never lost an opportunity of insinuating her intense dislike of the Frenchwoman, and appeared perpetually to be upon the very verge of making some explicit charges, or some shocking revelations respecting her, which, however, she as invariably evaded; and even, when Mrs. Marston once or twice insisted upon her explaining her meaning distinctly, she eluded her mistress's desire, and left her still in the same uneasy uncertainty. Marston, on his part, however much his conduct might tend to confirm suspicion, certainly did nothing to dissipate the painful and undefined apprehension respecting himself, which Mademoiselle de Barras, with such malign and mysterious industry, laboured to raise. His spirits and temper were liable to strange fluctuations. In the midst of that excited gaiety, to which, until lately, he had been so long a stranger, would sometimes intervene paroxysms of the blackest despair, all the ghastlier for the contrast, and with a suddenness so abrupt and overwhelming that one might have fancied him crossed by the shadow of some terrific apparition. Sometimes for a whole day, or even more, he would withdraw himself from the society of his family, and in morose and moody solitude take his meals alone in his library, and steal out unattended to wander among the thickets and glades of his park. Sometimes, again, he would sit for hours in the room which had been Sir Wynston's, and, with a kind of horrible resolution, often loiter there till after nightfall. In such hours the servants would listen with curious awe, as they heard his step, pacing to and fro, in that deserted and inauspicious chamber, while his voice, in broken sentences, was also imperfectly audible, as if maintaining a muttered dialogue. These eccentric practices gradually invested him, in the eyes of his domestics, with a certain preternatural mystery, which enhanced the fear with which they habitually regarded him, and was subsequently confirmed by his giving orders to have the furniture taken out of the ominous suite of rooms, and the doors nailed up and secured. He gave no reason for this odd and abrupt measure; and gossip of course reported that the direction had originated in his having encountered the spectre of the murdered baronet, in one of these strange and unseasonable visits to the scene of the fearful catastrophe. In addition to all this, Marston's conduct towards his wife became strangely capricious. He avoided her society more than ever, and when he did happen to exchange a few words with her, they were sometimes harsh and violent, and at others remorsefully gentle and sad, and this without any changes of conduct upon her part to warrant the wayward uncertainty of his treatment. Under all these circumstances, Mrs. Marston's unhappiness and uneasiness greatly increased. Mademoiselle de Barras, too, upon several late occasions, had begun to assume a tone of authority and dictation, which justly offended the mistress of the establishment. Meanwhile Charles Marston had returned to Cambridge, and Rhoda, no longer enjoying happy walks with her brother, pursued her light and easy studies with Mademoiselle de Barras, and devoted her leisure hours to the loved society of her mother. One day Mrs. Marston, sitting in her room with Rhoda, had happened to call her own maid, to take down and carefully dust some richly bound volumes which filled a bookcase in the little chamber. "You have been crying, Willett," said Mrs. Marston, observing that the young woman's eyes were red and swollen. "Indeed, and I was, ma'am," she replied, reluctantly, "and I could not help it, so I could not." "Why, what has happened to vex you? Has any one ill treated you?" said Mrs. Marston, who had an esteem for the poor girl. "Come, come, you must not fret about it; only tell me what has vexed you." "O, ma'am, no one has ill used me, ma'am; but I can't but be vexed sometimes, ma'am, and fretted to see how things is going on. I have one wish, just one wish, ma'am, and if I got that I'd ask no more," said the girl. "And what is it?" asked Mrs. Marston. "What do you wish for? Speak plainly, Willett. What is it?" "Ah, ma'am, if I said it, maybe you might not be pleased. Don't ask me, ma'am," said the girl, dusting the books very hard, and tossing them down again with angry emphasis. "I don't desire anybody's harm, God knows; but for all that I wish what I wish, and that is the truth." "Why, Willett, I really cannot account for your strange habit of lately hinting and insinuating, and always speaking riddles, and refusing to explain your meaning. What do you mean? Speak plainly. If there are any dishonest practices going on, it is your duty to say so distinctly." "O, ma'am, it is just a wish I have. I wish but it's no matter. If I could once see the house clear of that Frenchwoman "If you mean Mademoiselle de Barras, she is a lady," interrupted Mrs. Marston. "Well, ma'am, I beg pardon," continued the woman. "Lady or no lady, it is all one to me; for I am very sure, ma'am, she'll never leave the house till there is something bad comes about, and I can't bring myself to talk to you about her, ma'am. I can't say what I want to tell you; but oh, ma'am, for God's sake, try and get her out. Any way, no matter how, try and get rid of her." As she said this, the poor girl burst into a passionate agony of tears, and Mrs. Marston and Rhoda looked on in silent amazement, while she for some minutes continued to sob and weep. Section 10. The party were suddenly recalled from their various reveries by a knock at the chamber door. It opened, and the subject of the girl's deprecatory entreaty entered. There was something unusually excited and assured in Mademoiselle de Barras's air and countenance. Perhaps she had a suspicion that she had been the topic of their conversation. At all events, she looked round upon them with a smile, in which there was something supercilious, and even defiant; and, without waiting to be invited, sat herself down with a haughty air. "I was about to ask you to sit down, mademoiselle, but you have anticipated me," said Mrs. Marston, gravely. "You have something to say to me, I suppose. I am quite at leisure; so pray let me hear it now." Thank you, madame," replied she, with a sharp and even scornful glance. "I ought to have asked your permission to sit. I forgot. But you have condescended to give it without my doing so. That was very kind indeed.